right? So, for example, as far as I can tell, Dawkins doesn't know anything about
Ruslan.
the miracle of the loaves and the fishes.
Yeah.
Okay, so people will say, well, do you believe that happened literally, historically? It's like, well, yes, I believe that. It's okay. Okay, what do you mean by that? You're there in the way that you described.
Right.
And
what do you see?
What are the fish doing exactly? And the answer is, you don't know.
I think a Christian might say something like, my belief is that I have no idea, looking at those fish, what I would see in the process of them being converted into enough food for the 5,000 to eat. I have no idea what I would see. But I do know that what I would see is the fish end up being spread amongst the 5,000. I would see something at some event in which, when I look at the beginning, it's water, and when I look at the end, it's wine. And I mean, actually, I don't mean that Jesus turning water into wine is some kind of inextricably mythological story, and the question of whether it happened sort of doesn't matter, or maybe it happened in a meta manner, or maybe it happened in a hyper reality sense. I would be, as a Christian, committed to saying that it happened historically.
I'm more inclined, rather than to believe, I'm more inclined to understand. And then when I hit the limits of my understanding, I think, I don't understand that. Now, do I believe it or not believe it? I think often, especially with regards to biblical matters, let's say, I have a suspension of belief and disbelief. I approach the texts with respect, the same respect that I would approach a lab animal. It's like, I don't know what this is. Like, I seriously don't know. And I'm not going to come at it with axiomatic assumptions that are unquestionable. I'm going to try to see what's right in front of my eyes. I'm going to try to see what mystery reveals itself if I take this phenomenon seriously.
Alex is pointing to, hey, I don't know what happens with the water and the wine and how the fish multiply, but I do see the fruit of said miraculous, supernatural, law-defying event, right? Peterson seems to be more intrigued by the how. He's a scientist than him. And Alex is just pointing to the, well, do you believe in the what? Like, do you believe the thing happened?
Right.
Which I think is a great question. What do you think it is that, one, are you hearing him the same way I'm hearing him? And do you think that there's a reason for the need to know the how?
This to me points to our mechanism obsessed post-Enlightenment culture. And I actually think it's foolish in some sense to try to understand the mechanism of how a miracle took place. Because I don't think that miracles are, for one, they're not repeatable. And so they're not intended to be scientific. Furthermore, even within the realm of science, there are so many things that we know are true, but that we don't fully understand the mechanism for. So if the burden of proof to know whether or not something is true is, can we fully understand the mechanism, then we would be discrediting huge swaths of science. So I think that the fundamental endeavor of, if I can't know how did the water turn to wine, then it didn't turn to wine, is just silly, in my opinion.
Puzzling, for example, about Dawkins, because Dawkins formulated the idea of meme, which is, by the way, the same idea as archetype. It's exactly the same idea, except he just stopped. It's like, okay, there are memes, they're selected for. Okay, selected on what basis exactly? Does that mean there's a hierarchy of memes? Are the memes more likely, are the memes that are conserved?
This is the stuff that I think him and Jonathan Peugeot really found a lot of overlap on, is the idea of archetypes and memes and logos and all that kind of stuff. There's a Maps of Meaning book from his first, publishing thing. So that's where he's going.
More likely to be, what would you say, viable organisms? And if they're viable organisms, are they microcosms?
This is really interesting in terms of the survivability, because there's a point, I've spoken to Richard Dawkins, somebody pointed out to me that there might be a point of agreement between you two that has been overlooked. I don't know if you've ever come across the evolutionary argument against naturalism, or the argument from reason, the idea that if you're a materialist, you can't trust your reasonable faculties. So Alvin Plantinga formulated this very well, very, very geniusly, I think, in saying that if you believe that evolution by natural selection happens materially, what does natural selection select for? Survivability. So if you're a materialist, that means that the very rational faculty that you're using right now evolved not to be sensitive to truth, but to survivability.
Yes, that's right.
And if that's the case, well, why do you believe in the truth of evolution? Well, because you've been rationally convinced of it. The thing that you've just assented to, the belief itself, has just undercut the process by which you think that belief.
There's a whole, the New England pragmatists figured this out in like 1880.
Yeah, no, I think this is a fascinating, I think it really is just
It is.
It's exciting.
It's actually a point where Darwin and Newton do not come together.
How do you mean?
Well, the Darwinian definition of true and the Newtonian definition of true are not the same thing.
Here's the thing. You had a conversation with Sam Harris. You're talking about truth.
Yeah,
and you're
very
trying
awkward second talk I had with him. I was extremely ill.
It was awkward to listen to because it felt very much like, and I remember at the time thinking, what is this Jordan Peterson talking about? Like truth is like Darwinian. Truth is about like survivability. What do you mean truth?
The point that they're making about the intelligibility of the universe, given the way that the human mind is able to arrive at truth, is I think a very interesting point, and actually like a really powerful point towards theism. This is John Lennox has talked a lot about this idea that the scientific revolution was predicated upon the idea that we should expect law in nature if we believe in a law giver. And I don't mean moral law. I'm talking about the universal constants, gravity, the speed of light, things that are like the mathematical fixed ways that the universe operates. And he says, if God is real, then that's exactly what you should expect, is that intelligibility.
Regardless of if it's evolution or creation or intelligent design.
Well, evolution doesn't even touch on the universal constants. These are before life, presumably. This is as the universe expands, how does it land in this perfect Goldilocks position where everything works and is in a planet that is fit for humanity?
Yes.
That has nothing to do with evolution. That's a one-time event. You don't get, evolution's whole alleged power is in the numbers of it. But this is, unless we want to go to the multiverse, which is a whole other conversation. That all of the most recent cosmology is working away from. But if we want to just talk about the universe set up as if by an intelligent mind that wanted us to be here, and even atheists have admitted that it appears that someone wanted us to be here. The laws of, the laws of physics and chemistry seem to have been monkeyed with in order for things to be suitable for a species like us. And so anyway, what they're saying here I find to be interesting. It's not just that all of that exists, that the mathematical realities of the universe are fixed and suitable for life, but it's also that we have this thing inside of our noggins that allows us to actually understand all of that. And as we gaze into this grandeur, more and more and more, we discover more and more and more. And these things are apparently such that we can arrive at truth through them, rather than just, like they said, survivability. So it's the interplay between what's inside of us and what's outside of us, and that they work together to actually lead us to this mystical thing called truth.
Interesting.
It's true the way an arrow flies.
Yeah, right. And now I asked Richard Dawkins about the evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Yeah.
I said, well, how can you know that what you believe is true? And he said, because believing true things makes me more likely to survive.
Hey, watch where you go with that.
I didn't catch it at the time, but I thought to myself afterwards, it was one of my commenters on Patreon actually had mentioned this. He was listening to Richard, and I said, but sometimes it's at least possible that something that's false helps you to survive. The rustling in the bushes, believing that that's a lion every time or a tiger, even if it's not, that helps you to survive, because that one time that it is, you're still going to run away, and it costs you nothing to run away when it's not a tiger. So believing it's a tiger, even when it's not, is going to help you to survive.
That's why we have a negativity bias.
Yeah, and Dawkins said, of course there are some circumstances where believing something false could be beneficial to survival. And I said, well, how do you know that 2 + 2 = 4 is not one of those? And it seemed as though he was just saying that believing that would not be advantageous to our survival, which might well be true. But if that's the case, then suddenly I'm listening to what you're saying about truth being more sort of Darwinian and related to survivability. And I think maybe you two would agree there. And I think, well,
the negativity bias is really interesting, because he could, or Richard Dawkins could then make the argument use that to make the argument against God. You have this negativity bias because you're afraid of hell, but what if the bushes rattling isn't really a lion and you're running from it, but it doesn't cost you anything, right? It's like negativity biased and the Pascal's wager almost, So it's an interesting, I'm surprised they didn't go there about God specifically.
Yeah, you're saying if you grant that premise to be true, then should we consider how might it affect our a priori reaction to the idea of God? Yeah. So I'm not saying it's a good argument. I'm saying I'm surprised he didn't try to use that as an argument.
I'm more of aware of the things he knows that I don't know, that he is of the things I know that he doesn't know. Right. So, for example, as far as I can tell, Dawkins doesn't know anything about the Jungian tradition of literary interpretation. And that actually, if you're going to talk about religion, that's actually a fatal flaw. Right. So, and, he's called me, for example, drunk on symbols. It's like, well, The imagination is a biological function, and it has a structure and a purpose, and it has its own logos, its own intelligible order. And if you're not aware of that order, that doesn't make me drunk on symbols. It just means you don't know what you're talking about.
Now that frustration.
Here, he sounds like he's using the word logos different than what we know Jesus to be the logos. This is independent logos, and he connects it to symbols.
Yeah, I think he's talking about the pre-incarnation Greco idea of logos as like the reason for, like the logic or the reason for being in a more general sense.
Yeah, and because I asked Jonathan, I said, hey, when you're talking about the logos, like you're saying Jesus is ultimately the logos, Jonathan Peugeot, and he's like, yes, I'm talking about Jesus as the logos.
Well, and I think that's the huge difference. Is it's the question of, do all of these metaphors and symbols, like he's, they're talking about how Dawkins accused Peterson of being drunk on symbols. But I think this is the huge distinction, is what is at the bedrock. Is it literal or is it symbolic? And to me, it's obviously literal, because you run into a logical problem when you just have a metaphor pointing to a metaphor pointing to a metaphor. That can go on forever. But ultimately, and this is the idea about the logos. Well, so is it true that Christ was there at the foundation of everything? Like it talks about in the Proverbs, that wisdom, Christ is the wisdom of God. Wisdom was there with God. That Christ participated in the creation of everything. So that would be literal, right? And then the embodiment, the incarnation, would basically be Shakespeare writing himself into Hamlet.
Yeah.
But the mind of Shakespeare created the text of Hamlet.
Yes.
Shakespeare being a real literal person, right?
Yeah.
And then alternatively is the idea that no, somehow the bedrock is the symbol, and Christ is like Hercules, like Neo, like Braveheart, yet another metaphor, getting us to some symbol of logos or some symbol of ultimate savior or whatever. But Christ is just like Neo, and that they're both good examples of some ideal that we want. And I think that's the big distinction. Is Christ the genuine article that every other hero is pointing to, or that even the idea of logos is rooted in his actual literal reality of Jesus Christ? Or is he just another thing pointing to something else?
I've heard it described as when Christ enters history, it's like it like impacts everything pre him and post him. So it impacts some of the figures from BC, and it impacts everything moving forward. And that Christ is it's and both. Like he is the ultimate symbol that other archetypes are pointing to in a way before him. And then everything after him, Neo, fill in a blank, is also inspired by him because of that. But he's also, as C.S. Lewis said, the myth that's fact. Like it's the myth that's true. Yeah. So I think it's and both. And Peterson, because he's a creative, and a lot of these guys, Jonathan Peugeot, and these guys that are into the symbols, and Jonathan just had the Symbolic World Summit, and all they're all into they see the value in the symbolism as well.
Absolutely. And I think that I would literally say that, and I think this is J.R.R. Tolkien who put it this way, but the reason why we continuously write these stories is because they reflect our actual story. The real human condition, the real story that is unfolding across time is what we reflect through our imaginations. What if? Luke Skywalker, whatever. Like,
I instantly thought of Star Wars. Me and my son are going through. Me and my 9-year-old are going back to Star Wars, and I've watched a little bit as a kid. He's like getting into it, and it's totally spot on.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out the video. Comment down below and let me know what you think, and be sure to check out this video that YouTube is recommending just for you. Let me know if they nailed it. All right, I'll see you over there.
Peace.